They found my daughter's body somewhere around those bushes. Her clothing was scattered nearby. There was a metal pipe, and signs of a violent struggle covered the ground. Investigators would later determine that she had sustained 10 separate wounds to her neck and torso, at least 2 of which struck a critical artery. That single piece of information, shared by a grieving father standing at the edge of an overgrown lot in the middle of summer, would become the quiet starting point of one of the most disputed and emotionally devastating criminal cases in the recent history of the Moscow region. It was August 2015, in the town of Sergiev Posad, a city of modest industrial blocks and old Soviet-era housing complexes situated roughly 70 kilometers northeast of Moscow. The industrial district known as Zarya had long been one of those forgotten corners of the city, the kind of place where crumbling concrete fences enclosed stretches of dead grass, broken glass, and sprawling thickets of weeds that nobody maintained and nobody visited. In the early hours of the morning, as pale golden light began to break over the rooftops and treetops on the city's edge, a local resident set out on a routine walk with his dog. The animal pulled toward an abandoned section of land bordering the district's outer perimeter. In the shadow of a dense cluster of overgrown shrubs, partially obscured by tall weeds and tangled brush, the man saw something that stopped him completely. A young woman lay motionless on the ground, her body partly visible in the morning light filtering through the leaves above. Emergency responders and forensic specialists arrived at the scene within the hour. What they documented was deeply troubling. The young woman had sustained 10 distinct knife wounds. 3 of those wounds were concentrated in the neck region, striking close to vital structures. The remaining 7 were distributed across the torso. Across her arms and body, investigators noted extensive bruising and contusions consistent with a prolonged and desperate physical struggle. Nearby, partially obscured by the vegetation, lay a number of items that would later become central to the investigation, including a men's hooded sweatshirt and a small collection of business cards from a local toy store. But the detail that immediately commanded the attention of every forensic examiner on the scene had nothing to do with what was found. It had everything to do with what was missing. Given the severity and depth of 10 wounds of that nature, the soil beneath the young woman's body was almost completely clean. There was virtually no trace of the kind of significant blood evidence that would be expected at a primary crime scene of this magnitude. The earth was dry. The surrounding brush showed no signs of disturbance consistent with a violent struggle. The forensic team arrived at an unavoidable conclusion almost immediately. This location was not where the attack had taken place. The Zarya industrial lot was a secondary location, a place chosen deliberately, under the cover of darkness, to conceal what had happened somewhere else. Someone had transported the body here after the fact, leaving it in a spot unlikely to be discovered quickly, buying time for evidence to degrade and trails to go cold. The investigation into the circumstances of her death was only beginning, but already the case carried the hallmarks of something carefully orchestrated rather than opportunistic. The work that followed in the forensic laboratory over the coming days added layers of technical complexity to an already troubling picture. Analysts examined every piece of physical evidence recovered from the scene and from the young woman's body with painstaking precision. One of the first and most significant findings concerned the nature and trajectory of the wounds themselves. Forensic medical examiners studied the angle and direction of each wound channel in meticulous detail and reached a clear conclusion. The orientation of the injuries, particularly those to the right side of the neck, was consistent with an attacker who had wielded the blade with their left hand. For investigators, this was the first genuine narrowing of the suspect profile, a physiological characteristic that could be used to either include or exclude individuals from serious consideration. The mechanics of the attack also suggested close physical proximity, indicating that the attacker had been standing immediately beside the victim rather than approaching from a distance. The examination of the victim's clothing revealed additional findings that would later become some of the most contested elements of the entire case. Laboratory analysis of fabric fibers identified biological traces containing DNA material attributed to at least 3 distinct male individuals. The genetic profiles did not overlap. This finding formally moved the investigation away from the theory of a lone attacker and placed it firmly within the framework of a group offense. Perhaps even more significant was the condition of a thin garment found beneath the victim's outer clothing. Its shoulder straps had been tightly knotted together with a deliberate double knot. Forensic technicians carefully swabbed this knot and recovered epithelial skin cells from an individual other than the victim. Someone had physically handled that garment, tied that knot, and left behind a biological signature in doing so. The importance of this detail cannot be overstated. That knot represented a deliberate act, a moment of contact, and a moment that preserved identifiable evidence of who had been there. Given the weight of these forensic findings, the procedural documentation that followed in the initial stages of the official investigation struck many observers as deeply at odds with the physical evidence. The original investigative report filed at the scene contained a notation stating that there were no signs of a struggle and no indication of any assault of an intimate nature. This created an immediate and serious logical contradiction within the case file itself. The physical evidence, including the bruising across the victim's body, the deliberate knotting of her clothing, and the DNA profiles of 3 separate men, stood in direct opposition to that single clinical sentence in an official document. That contradiction, buried in procedural paperwork at the very outset of the case, would later form the foundation upon which a prosecution was built against a man whose DNA was never found on those knotted straps. The victim was identified as 23-year-old Alexandra Bondarenko, a young resident of Sergiv Posad whose life, by all accounts, had been defined by quiet responsibility and genuine warmth. At 18, she had married. At 19, she gave birth to a son named Maxim. By 20, the marriage had ended, and Alexandra had assumed sole responsibility for raising her child while simultaneously pursuing her education. She completed her studies at a local college and found employment at a retail shop, working rotating shifts of 2 days on and 2 days off. Her family operated as a close-knit, coordinated unit. On her working days, Alexandra would bring 4-year-old Maxim to stay with her parents, Dmitry and his wife, who were devoted grandparents and fully committed to helping their daughter build a stable life. The arrangement was consistent and reliable, a quiet system of love and practicality that had become the backbone of the Bondarenko household. The final days Alexandra spent with her family were entirely unremarkable in the best possible sense. On the 10th of August, she visited her parents at their dacha, a small country property outside the city. Her father Dmitry would later recall those hours as completely ordinary. They picked currants together from the garden bushes. They talked and laughed about everyday things, minor household matters, plans for the coming weeks. As the afternoon faded into evening, Alexandra kissed her son goodbye, boarded a bus back into the city, and told her parents she was meeting a friend and would pick Maxim up after the weekend. There was nothing in her manner, nothing in her voice, that suggested anything was wrong. Nobody said goodbye like it was the last goodbye. In the hours following the discovery of her body, one of the most painful responsibilities that fell to Dmitry and his wife was finding a way to explain the unexplainable to a 4-year-old boy. They composed a story for Maxim, a gentle fairy tale about a frog mother who had traveled to another world and could no longer come back. When his grandmother finished the story and quietly told Maxim that his mother had also died, the boy cried out and wept with a grief far too large for someone his age. For the next 5 years, the family worked carefully to shield him from the details of the criminal case and the media attention that surrounded it. They succeeded until Maxim was 10 years old, when the constant presence of cameras and journalists and televised court proceedings made it impossible to maintain the protective barrier any longer. Throughout those years, a framed photograph of Alexandra occupied a place of honor in his room. Every evening before bed, Maxim would walk to the photograph and wish his mother good night, a small and heartbreaking ritual that spoke volumes about the bond that even tragedy could not fully sever. The evening of August 10, 2015 had begun simply enough. Alexandra was spending time with a group of acquaintances in the courtyard of a residential building in Sergiv Posad. It was a birthday celebration, casual and informal. As the night progressed, 2 young men arrived who had not been part of the original gathering, Vladimir Bukin and Artyom Dobrinin. According to witness accounts provided during the later investigation, Bukin had not been invited in advance. Someone in the group had reached out to him spontaneously, and he had come. Almost immediately after his arrival, the atmosphere shifted. A confrontation broke out between Bukin and several of the other people present. Rather than the situation calming down, Bukin placed a call to Dobrinin and asked him to come, apparently seeking backup or support. When Dobrinin arrived, the composition of the gathering had fundamentally changed, and the tension that had been building refused to dissipate. Sometime in the middle of the night, the group moved to the vicinity of a small alcohol retail shop known locally as the KH Melny Kapras, which translates roughly as the Hoppy Whim. This movement was partially captured by the only functioning exterior surveillance camera in the area, mounted above the entrance to the store. The footage was grainy and narrow in its coverage, but it documented something important. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, Alexandra Bondarenko could be seen standing near the entrance to the shop. She crouched down at one point, and beside her stood Vladimir Bukin. The camera captured the moment when Bukin took her handbag, the bag containing her personal belongings and identification documents. Moments later, both of them moved out of the camera's limited field of view. The exterior camera covered only a narrow zone directly in front of the doorway. Anyone who stepped a few meters to either side or around the corner of the building disappeared entirely from the frame, swallowed by the darkness beyond the lens. What happened in those unseen moments became the central gap in the official investigation. Inside the shop, a second camera had been operating, a color unit with significantly higher resolution that could have provided a far clearer picture of the events of that night and the condition and behavior of everyone present. This footage could have shown the full sequence of events, the state Alexandra was in, how the men around her behaved, and what, if anything, was exchanged or discussed. However, when investigators and family members later gained access to the case materials, they discovered that the evidentiary record from that night had been severely reduced. Of the 936 separate video file segments initially collected from the area, only approximately 15 short clips remained in the official case file. Hundreds of segments had vanished. The internal camera footage from inside the shop, the footage that might have answered the most critical questions about what transpired at 1:30 in the morning, was gone. After the moment Alexandra disappeared from camera view at 1:30 a.m., she stopped answering her phone entirely. Witness accounts from that evening began to conflict with each other in ways that investigators were never fully able to reconcile. Some accounts described her leaving the area willingly. Others suggested she was in a state of distress. The inconsistencies were never formally resolved in any documented investigative summary. What is known is that by 6:00 in the morning, her body had been found on the abandoned lot in the Zaria district. The window between those 2 points, from 1:30 a.m. to 6:00 a.m., became the critical timeline that the investigation never fully reconstructed in a publicly verifiable and evidence-supported manner. The forensic reconstruction that investigators developed, based on the pattern of wounds, the absence of significant blood evidence at the scene, and the biological traces found on the victim's clothing, pointed toward a crime that had taken place in a confined space. The nature and angle of the injuries, combined with the complete absence of outdoor disturbance indicators, led forensic analysts to conclude that the attack had most likely occurred inside a vehicle. This would explain why the ground at the Zaria lot was clean. It would explain why the surrounding vegetation showed no signs of a struggle. The body had been moved, transported through the city in the hours before dawn, and deposited at a location the perpetrators believed was sufficiently isolated to delay discovery. The personal items found near the body, including the toy store business cards from Alexandra's bag, appeared to have been scattered deliberately, staged to create the impression of a chaotic random robbery gone wrong. The forensic evidence pointed clearly toward a group of individuals acting in coordination. 3 distinct DNA profiles on the clothing, a knotted garment with skin cells from an external individual, a left-handed attacker whose physiological characteristics matched one of the men who had been present at the gathering that night. The biological and physical evidence formed a coherent and interconnected picture, but the formal investigation, as it developed through the months that followed, moved in a different direction. Kirill Krodov was a man whose name entered this story not through any direct connection to the events of that evening, but through a chain of associations that investigators built piece by piece into a prosecution. Krodov was 25 years old at the time, and he was not a healthy man. He had undergone surgery to remove one of his lungs some time before, a procedure that had left him classified as a disabled individual. At the time of the alleged offense, his body weight hovered around 44 kilograms, severely underweight for a man of his age and height. He was battling the aftereffects of tuberculosis. His physical condition was documented, medically verified, and available in the public record. The people who knew him described someone who spent most of his time at home, largely confined to his apartment by the limitations of his health. On the night of August 10th and into the morning of August 11th, Krotov's stepfather Mikhail, a retired police major with 7 years of experience in the homicide division, stated clearly and on the record that Krodov had been home throughout that entire period. A neighbor in the building corroborated this account independently, stating that he had seen Krodov inside the apartment that night. In Krodov's apartment, investigators documented a large furniture unit, a solid wall-mounted storage system, that was positioned in a way that physically blocked the front door from the inside. Moving this unit would have required significant physical effort, something that investigators themselves acknowledged was beyond the capacity of a man in Krodov's documented condition. The fact that the furniture blocked the exit was entered into investigative reports. The neighbor's corroborating statement was collected, and then, for reasons never formally explained in the case documents, both pieces of information were set aside without substantive rebuttal. Investigators raised the theoretical possibility that Krodov could have exited through a ground-floor window, given that his apartment was on the first floor, but no physical evidence was ever produced to support this theory, no footprints beneath the window. No witnesses who had seen a gravely ill man in the early morning hours climbing through a window frame. The theory existed only as a written supposition, unanchored to any verifiable fact. The second pillar of the prosecution's case rested on mobile phone location data. Investigators asserted that cell tower records showed Krotov's phone had been active in areas near the relevant locations on the night in question. When Dmitry Bondarenko, Alexandra's father, obtained access to photocopies of the case materials and began systematically reviewing them, he discovered what he described as critical inconsistencies in the technical data. The original data storage disks received directly from telecommunications providers were no longer present in the file. In their place were shortened duplicate copies. Within these copies, the listed addresses of the base stations that had allegedly registered signals from Krotov's phone did not match actual infrastructure. One address cited in the documents, on a street called Vifinskaya, did not correspond to any location where cell towers had ever been installed, according to Dmitry's own verification of the city's geography. The real tower covering that portion of the city was located on a different street entirely, at the site of a bread factory. The address substitution in the official documents had the effect of placing Krotov's phone in a location that aligned with the route Alexandra had traveled, a geographic alignment that would have been absent if the actual tower addresses had been used. For Dmitry, a man who had spent years scrutinizing every page of the case file with the focus of someone who had lost everything, this discrepancy was not a clerical error. It was a deliberate alteration of official documentation. In 2019, the criminal trial concluded with a verdict that drew immediate attention for the internal contradictions it appeared to contain. Throughout the investigation, the framing of certain events had shifted in ways that critics found difficult to reconcile. Behaviors that investigators had initially characterized in one light for two individuals who had demonstrably been present with Alexandra on the night of her death were subsequently reframed as criminal intent attributable to Krotov. The court found that a serious assault of an intimate nature had been the motive behind the attack, and on that basis, Kirill Krotov was sentenced to 17 years in a strict regime penal colony. The full weight of criminal responsibility for actions that physical and biological evidence had not placed at Krotov's hands was assigned to a man who was not genetically connected to the knotted clothing of the victim, whose medical condition made the act physically implausible, and whose presence at the scene had never been established through any tangible material proof. "I am not guilty of what I am accused of," Krotov stated in the aftermath of the verdict. "I did not harm anyone. I did not intimidate anyone. I forced no one to do anything. I am an innocent person. A verdict has been handed down against me, and yet here I stand." The years that followed the trial produced one of the more unusual partnerships in this case's long history. Dmitry Bondarenko, the father of the woman who had lost her life, sought out and made contact with Mikhail, the stepfather of the man convicted of that death. It would be difficult to imagine two men arriving at the same table with more cause for mutual pain and suspicion. But Dmitry had spent years reviewing the case files, and what he found had left him with a belief he could not shake. The wrong man was sitting in prison. Mikhail, drawing on his 7 years of professional experience in homicide investigation, agreed to review the materials from an operational standpoint. What the two men found when they worked through the documents together reinforced both of their concerns. They identified what they believed to be falsified billing records, the disappearance of original telecommunication disks, and the absence of required official stamps on certain forensic examination documents, procedural irregularities that Mikhail recognized from his years in law enforcement as the kind of detail that experienced officers know to look for. The alliance between the two families extended beyond document review. Dmitry, who worked as a taxi driver and had modest but reliable transportation, began driving Mikhail and Krotov's mother the 250 kilometers from Sergiy Posad to the penal colony in Tver Oblast so that they could visit Kirill. Mikhail had no means of making that journey independently on a regular basis. Dmitry made it possible. Two fathers separated by the most painful kind of divide imaginable, driving through the Russian countryside together to visit a prison, united by a shared conviction that justice had not been served. They filed appeals. They brought their findings to the investigative committee. They appeared on national television programs. Dmitry stood in the reception rooms of official institutions and said openly, on the record, that the man convicted of his daughter's death was innocent, and that the people who had actually been present that night remained free, protected, he believed, by connections within the law enforcement community. By late 2025, events had begun to alter the cast of the story in ways that no legal proceeding could have engineered. Vladimir Bukin, the man whose DNA had been identified on the knotted straps of Alexandra's garment, died in an incident on a railway line near Sergiy Posad. He was struck by a train. His injuries were fatal. The man who had taken Alexandra's handbag from her at 1:30 in the morning, the man whose biological evidence placed him in physical contact with her clothing at or near the time of her death, was gone before any formal interrogation under renewed investigative scrutiny had ever taken place. When Dmitri learned of Buchan's death, he received the news without visible emotion and recorded it simply as a fact. The earthly justice system, he noted quietly, had never managed to ask Buchan the questions that mattered most. The second man whose presence that night had been documented by witnesses and whose physical characteristics aligned with the forensic evidence was Artyom Dobrynin, the son of a senior police officer. In the summer of 2023, Dobrynin signed a military service contract and was deployed to an active conflict zone. Since that time, no verified information about his current status has been made officially available. Informal reports suggest he may have died during his service. As of early 2026, he remains listed as missing. The two individuals whose DNA and physical presence connected them most directly to the evidence recovered from Alexandra's body had, through separate and unrelated chains of events, become unreachable by any investigative body seeking to re-examine the case. And yet Kirill Krotov remains in prison. His 17-year sentence stands unaltered as of the beginning of 2026, despite the death of Buchan, despite the questions surrounding the altered billing records, despite the missing video footage, despite the unsigned forensic documents, and despite the corroborated testimony that placed him at home throughout the night in question. The legal system's mechanisms for acknowledging and correcting error move slowly, and in this case, they have not yet moved at all. Krotov continues to manage the health consequences of his early